This series of videos introduces the 38 chapters of the Routledge Handbook of Environmental Movements. It's a project of the Social Change Lab, and we gratefully acknowledge the support of the Mary Lee bequest for the work of our team.
Hi, everyone. My name is Winifred Lewis, and I'm a professor of psychology at the University of Queensland.
Hi, everyone. I'm Andrea Zeng. I'm a psychologist and a research assistant in University of Queensland.
Hi, I'm Joyce Yuan, and I'm a psychological science student at the University of Queensland.
And what we're doing are making introductory videos to each of the 38 chapters in the Handbook of Environmental Movements, the Routledge Handbook of Environmental Movements. And today we're making a video about chapter 24, which is titled Social Class and Environmental Movements. The authors are Magnus Vennerhag and Anders Hillmo, and Vennerhag is a professor of sociology at Södertörn University in Sweden, and Hillmo is a researcher at Lund University School of Economics and Management, who studies sociology, policy, and social movement studies. So I guess for a lot of people, especially psychologists, we need to ask, what is social class? And the author talks about how there's really different definitions dating back to Marx. Joyce, can you give us Marx's definitions of social class?
Yeah, sure. According to Marx, he sees social class as primarily two groups of people, those who owns the means of production and those who earn their wages by laboring, and that's being referred to as the working class.
Yeah. And in Marx's incredibly influential approach, the workers are exploited by the people that own the capital, the capitalists. And so they have to unite, and they have distinct interests. And as we'll learn later in the chapter, that was a focus of a lot of protests in the 19th century. But then a guy called Max Weber came along, and he was a sociologist who said, in addition to the distinction between those who are more and less empowered socially, we also need to think about different sectors and different occupations. Sorry, not sectors. Weber was occupations. Weber said we need to think about different occupations because they compete with each other, and their professional and occupational groups put them in certain life trajectories with certain categories of life outcomes. So being more professionalized and educated or less. And that tied into contemporary analyses of class in sociology by people like Esch and others, who distinguished the vertical stratification of professional or middle class and working class, but who also distinguished different sectors, including the administrative sector, which is like managers, independent work like small business owners and people that own large companies, and then people that are working in technical and scientific aspects, and then people that are in service, including health and education. And so by looking at those different classes in the Esch's framework, we can often understand different composition of the movements. And in particular, we can understand that movements often don't equally draw from all classes. And so I think we were then going to talk about how class was engaged by theories of social movements. Is that right, Andrea?
Yes. So during the 1960s and the 1970s, we actually know very little about how the social composition of environmental movements are kind of related to the emergence of the modern environmental movement. And for example, the white and male middle class from the late 19th centuries to the 1950s are very dominant in those environmental movement activities. And it is only when we come to the late 1960s and there is emergence of the modern environmental movement where studies kind of look into like why this social composition has a specific patterns that kind of influence the environmental movements.
I remember the theorists also differed between Europe and North America, where the European early theories and research on social movement tended to study union activists and talk about their class background, whereas the North American tradition tended to not really engage with class at all and use individually framed concepts like relative deprivation, where people were more likely to protest if they compared themselves to others.
Yes. And
Sorry.
also, the studies that look into the social composition also find out that there is a highly educated middle class that both dominates and also is overrepresented in the than the general population. And on the opposite, like the working class is less represented in those activities.
Yeah. And there was a sort of theory of the 1960s that there were new social movements that were emerging, including the environmental movement, but also women's liberation and pride and so on, gay pride, that is. And that the idea was that these were movements of people that were comparatively wealthy because they had something called post-materialist values, that that they had satisfied their economic needs and now they were interested in more. And so the idea was that compared to, for example, the movement for the working class, the labor movement, that these new movements had a lot of middle class people in them. And there's an extremely cool study by the authors Hilmo and Vennerhag in 2015 that actually went to 75 different protest events in 8 countries and looked at what professional background people had that were attending the rallies. And so they did find that in the environmental protests, the middle class was overrepresented relative to their population of the country, and the working class was underrepresented. But what was so fascinating is that they found that was also the case for the May Day rally, which is a workers' rights celebration, and for anti-austerity protests, which was about the government cutting services to the poor. And so they found that middle class being overrepresented in protest was true not just of the environmental movement, but of other workers' movements as well. Why would that be, Zilin? Why would middle class people be more represented in protest?
Yeah, the reasons that middle class are more active is mainly because the first one is that they are more flexible in terms of their working hours. So they had greater autonomy to participate in these movements. And then the second reason is probably they have more connection to the social networks. So the activism is more common in their social groups. And then a third reason might be, as what Professor Winifred has said, they are less concerned about the materialist or economic growth and full employment. So they are less concerned about these materialists, and then the moral value starts to kick in.
Yeah. And I guess the fact that the middle class are more represented even in workers' movements highlights the power of those first 2 factors, probably more than the third, because the idea with post-materialism was that people would choose to participate in all these kind of extra rights activities, like for the environment, because they'd already satisfied their their economic rights. And finding that the working classes still underrepresented in movements for the working class kind of highlights that there's something there around what the sociologists called biographical availability, meaning if you've got more free time because you have more flexible working conditions, and job security, which is also important. That's the theory anyways. And then I guess when we look at the later work, it has really kind of tended to confirm that the highly educated middle class dominates and is overrepresented in many different types of environmental movements, including climate change and anti-nuclear, but also across other protests. And one factor harkening back to Esch's distinction and Weber's distinction between different professional groups is that what we find when we dive into it is that it's middle-class people from the sociocultural sectors, that's health, education, and the service sectors, that are especially likely to participate in all forms of political activity. And that hasn't been the case necessarily when we look at the tech sectors, that they haven't been overrepresented, middle-class tech people in movements. But that's changing, I believe, right? Andrea, tell us about the latest research.
Yes, so we have started like cool surveys to really look at the data about the class composition of environmental movement activities, and there are some findings that is quite similar to what we predict as the patterns. About 77%, so almost 80% of the protesters participate in the environmental movements are from the middle class, and this is twice the share of the general population. And in comparison, only 15% of the participations are from the working class. So there are less than a third of the general public. And we also see there is a predominance of the social cultural professionals, that this percentage is 3 times as high as the general population. So this is the professionals who are in teaching
health and the service professions, I think, like the relationship of people to each other, including psychologists.
Yes, that is. And we have still find some striking differences that from our survey data, that is, we have a much larger proportion of students that is involving in the recent environmental movements, which is 48% compares to in 2019, compares to the 19% participation of students in the past. And also there is a decrease in the share of self-employed professionals and larger employers. From the decline is from 12% to 8%. The third finding we find is that while there is only 7% of participants from the technical professions and technicians are participating in environmental movements in the around in 2012, there is a exciting increase that they are increasing their share to around almost doubled to the to 13%. And this finding is very encouraging, because it is in line with the persistent message that politicians should listen to the scientists. And
and I'll just jump in there. I think Zillan was going to talk a little about that, right? Like, so we saw increases in the proportion of students, partly because of the school strikes, when people put forward an environmental movement around students' needs. And then we've also got this increase in the tech sector. And tell us about that, Zillan.
Yeah, as what Andrea has said, there are changing in the framing of climate movements. So people are more prone, or they have more positive attitude towards scientific facts. So this pro-science framing has a really significant impact in this participants of technical professions. And then the second reason is that there are like, sorry, just
yeah, no worries. I think the second point was that there was a broader mobilization of the technical and scientific community, where in April 2017, there was a big March for Science, which occurred in the US, but also around the world. And it was really overlapping with environmental movement, but it was really talking about the importance of governments engaging with science and engaging more broadly with reality as they make plans and make policies. So I think there was a mobilization and a new frame for the environment movement, like what you were saying.
Yeah, and then it is also important that we have established like a whole industry and academic community around these climate issues. So one example would be the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, so namely the IPCC. So we are having more and more people coming in working in this field, whether it's doing research or doing like works around the climate change problems.
Yeah.
So that is also one of the reasons.
Yeah, and sociologists call that institutionalization, where the environmental movement is not just protesters, but increasingly involves, people who are in paid roles that are trying to protect the earth. And that includes in government environmental departments or science officers, and it includes the UN bodies like the IPCC. And then I think that the end of the section that's really talking about how well, I should say a part that I missed as we went through the chapter was a discussion of how this overrepresentation of the middle class in the environmental movement is much more true of the global north than it is of the global south. So when we look at what's happening in developing countries, a lot of the leadership is provided by indigenous peoples and by peoples from disadvantaged groups that are resisting land grabs and pollution from foreign companies or large international corporations that are not attentive to the local needs and to the local environment. So that's a point made by the author. And I guess in closing, the author talks about how the overrepresentation of the middle class in the environmental movement and elsewhere, and how that's distinct in the global north versus the global south, is something that people interested in social movements should really look more broadly at. That research on the environmental movement and class is really neglected, and that actually it is really important, because if we understand what sectors are mobilized and which ones are not, then we can seek to develop new frames and new messages to draw in the sectors that don't feel empowered or interested to act now. So by really drawing more on frames like environmental justice, perhaps we might mobilize disadvantaged communities alongside more affluent and educated ones. So overall, I think this is an interesting chapter, probably a bit outside all of our experiences as psychologists. I appreciated the opportunity to learn more about what class is and how it's approached in modern sociological theories. And I also appreciated the opportunity to reflect on the class background, which certainly reflects, my experience. I feel like we are, all three of us, actually sociocultural people in highly educated professions. So it's perhaps not a coincidence. We're really, exemplifying this chapter that we're taking a role in developing these resources and being the voice of the movement. But it's something that I haven't thought enough about, so I look forward to thinking more about. What about you guys? What did you take from the chapter, Andrea?
Yeah, it is a very like when I'm reading, I'm also reflecting, because there are different composition, not only class composition and also like occupational composition. This environmental movements, when some class get overrepresented and some class doesn't really have a voice, like have a say in there. So as classified as a social cultural professional, I was also, when I'm reading the chapter, I also find, like, even though we are kind of overrepresented, I still have much to learn.
Yeah.
About how to like mobilize, to get more mobilized, and to better participate in the movement. So I think in general, we need more like better framing in order to attract like being more attractive to different class and different occupation. And I think one of the example, like the technician profession is like creating, like increasing their share in this movement, is a very encouraging example. And of like growing our groups and creating ties to like other group members, so we can include them as when we have this collective identity as a pro-environmental group members, and we can get them more motivated to act and be more environmental friendly.
Yeah. And what about you, Zilland or Joyce?
Yeah.
Sorry.
It's okay. Both are my names. So
Yeah.
I just find it interesting that the author mentioned in the end that about 89% of participants responded to the question that whether we should prioritize environmental protection or jobs and economic growth, that one. So I think it is really important that we frame how we frame the environmental protection. So I've noticed that in Western communities in China, there are different approaches to how politics or political campaigns frame these terms. So in China, when I think of environmental protection, there was a very famous slogan that says clear water and lavish mountains are mountains of gold and silver. So there, the government is really directly correlates the economic growth and the protection of environment. Whereas in Western communities, they tend to like highlight the sustainability or moral values of environmental protection. So I think they took very different approach. And so that is also influencing how different class of people and people in different occupations are approaching these
That's
movements.
Right. Yeah. And I feel like the lesson for me, like what you guys are really both saying, is that maybe if we can articulate it in all ways, because all ways are actually true, right? Like it is important and it is our future economically and it is about justice. They're all true frames, and by only using one or overemphasizing a technical frame or a moral frame and neglecting those economic arguments, we may not be broadening the movement as much as we are able to do and need to do. Well, I think that's a fun way to end. Thank you, Joyce. Thank you, Andrea, for participating today. And thank you to our viewers for staying with us through this video. Bye now.
Bye.
For those of you watching, be sure to subscribe and follow us at Social Change UQ, and check out our website for more videos.